On the morning of September 1, 1939, German forces crossed the border into Poland. Aircraft struck military positions, transportation networks, and communication centers. Armored formations advanced rapidly, supported by infantry, artillery, and air power. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany. In Europe, the Second World War had officially begun. But a conflict that would spread across continents, last 6 years, and kill tens of millions of people could not have been created in a single morning. The invasion of Poland was the immediate trigger. Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany were directly responsible for starting the European war. But behind that decision were nearly 2 decades of economic crisis, political instability, extreme nationalism, imperial ambition, racial ideology, and repeated failures by the international community to stop aggression before it became unstoppable. To understand why the Second World War happened, we must return to the end of the previous World War. In November 1918, the fighting of the First World War came to an end. Much of Europe had been devastated. Millions of soldiers and civilians were dead. The German, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian empires had collapsed or broken apart. Many survivors believed they had witnessed the last war of such a scale. They were wrong. The peace created after 1918 did not resolve every conflict that had caused the war. In some cases, it created new divisions, new resentments, and new opportunities for political extremists. The Second World War did not begin because one treaty failed, one politician made a mistake, or one country wanted revenge. It began because several dangerous forces developed at the same time, and because those forces were repeatedly allowed to grow. In 1919, the victorious Allied powers imposed the Treaty of Versailles on Germany. Germany lost territory and its overseas colonies. Its armed forces were severely restricted. The Rhineland was demilitarized, and the German government was required to accept responsibility for the war and pay reparations. For many Germans, Versailles became a symbol of national humiliation. However, it would be misleading to claim that the treaty automatically caused the Second World War. During much of the 1920s, relations between Germany and the other European powers showed signs of improvement. Reparations were adjusted, foreign loans supported German recovery, and Germany gradually returned to international diplomacy. The greater danger was how political extremists used the treaty. Nationalists promoted the false claim that Germany had not truly been defeated on the battlefield. According to this conspiracy theory, the army had been betrayed by politicians, socialists, communists, and Jewish citizens inside Germany. Adolf Hitler used this myth repeatedly. He did not merely promise economic recovery. He promised to reverse the outcome of 1918, destroy the restrictions of Versailles, rebuild the German military, reunite German-speaking populations, and create a new empire. At the center of Nazi ideology was the belief that Germany required more living space in Eastern Europe. Hitler did not view the people already living there as equal communities with legitimate rights. Nazi racial doctrine treated them as obstacles to be displaced, enslaved, or destroyed. Versailles created resentment, but Nazi ideology transformed that resentment into a program of military conquest and racial domination. In a stable society, such an extremist movement might have remained politically marginal. But in 1929, the global economy collapsed. The Great Depression began in the United States and spread across Europe. Germany was especially vulnerable because its recovery depended heavily on foreign credit. When American loans disappeared, banks failed, factories closed, and unemployment rose dramatically. Families that had believed their lives were becoming stable once again faced poverty, uncertainty, and fear. Economic crisis did not automatically produce dictatorship. Many countries suffered during the Depression without becoming fascist states. But in Germany, the economic collapse combined with a young and unstable democracy, weak coalition governments, political violence, fear of communism, and widespread disappointment with the existing system. The Nazi Party offered simple answers to complicated problems. Germany was suffering because of Versailles. Democracy was weak because politicians were corrupt. Society was divided because of internal enemies. Only one powerful leader could restore order. These explanations were built on lies, racism, and conspiracy theories. But during a time of crisis, they appealed to millions of people who had lost confidence in democratic institutions. On January 30, 1933, Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. The Nazis had never won a majority of the national vote in a free election. But once Hitler entered government, he quickly destroyed democratic restraints, eliminated political opposition, restricted civil rights, and transformed Germany into a one-party dictatorship. From that point forward, war was no longer simply a possibility. It became part of the state's long-term purpose. Even a dictator with enormous ambition cannot easily begin a world war if other nations stop him early. That brings us to another deep cause of the conflict: the failure of international security. After the First World War, the League of Nations was created to resolve disputes and protect the independence of its members. In theory, aggression against one country would bring a united response from the international community. In practice, the League had no army of its own. It depended on the cooperation of powerful member states, and the United States never joined. Its weakness first became clear in Asia. In 1931, the Japanese military occupied Manchuria, a vast and resource-rich region of China. Japan established a puppet state called Manchukuo. The League investigated the seizure and refused to recognize it as legitimate. But it could not force Japan to withdraw. Japan simply left the League in 1933 and kept the territory. The lesson was dangerous. A major power could use military force to seize land and face little more than diplomatic criticism. In 1935, Fascist Italy, led by Benito Mussolini, invaded Ethiopia. Both countries were members of the League of Nations. The League condemned the invasion and imposed limited sanctions, but the measures were too weak to stop the Italian campaign. Ethiopia was conquered. Once again, aggression had succeeded. Hitler watched these failures carefully. In 1935, Germany openly began rearmament in violation of the Treaty of Versailles. In March 1936, German troops entered the demilitarized Rhineland. This was a major gamble. The German military was not yet prepared for a serious confrontation with France and Britain. If France had responded decisively, German forces might have been ordered to withdraw. But France was unwilling to act without British support, and Britain did not consider the remilitarization of German territory sufficient reason for another war. Hitler succeeded without firing a major shot. In March 1938, Germany annexed Austria. No foreign power intervened. Hitler then demanded the Sudetenland, a border region of Czechoslovakia with a large German-speaking population. Britain and France faced a difficult choice. They could defend Czechoslovakia and risk another European war, or they could accept Hitler's demand in the hope that it would be his final territorial claim. In September 1938, at the Munich Conference, Britain and France agreed to allow Germany to take the Sudetenland. Czechoslovakia had almost no meaningful voice in the decision concerning its own territory. This policy became known as appeasement. Appeasement is often described only as cowardice, but the situation was more complicated. British and French leaders remembered the catastrophic losses of the First World War. Public opinion strongly opposed another conflict. Their economies were still recovering from the Depression, and their armed forces needed more time to prepare. Some also believed that parts of Germany's dissatisfaction with Versailles were understandable. But appeasement depended on a false assumption. It assumed that Hitler's demands were limited and that he could eventually be satisfied. In March 1939, German forces occupied the remaining Czech lands. This was no longer an attempt to unite German-speaking populations. Hitler had taken control of territory inhabited mainly by non-Germans and broken the assurances he had given only months earlier. Britain and France now understood that Hitler did not merely want to revise Versailles. He intended to dominate Europe by force. While Europe moved toward war, large-scale conflict had already begun in Asia. In July 1937, Japan expanded its invasion of China. For millions of Chinese civilians, the Second World War did not begin in September 1939. It had already been underway for years. Japan's expansion reflected another cause of the global conflict: imperial competition and the struggle for resources. Japan was a major industrial power, but it lacked sufficient domestic supplies of oil, rubber, iron, and other strategic materials. Military leaders argued that controlling Manchuria, China, and eventually Southeast Asia would allow Japan to build a self-sufficient empire. But the lack of resources did not make invasion unavoidable. It created pressure, not justification. Japan's leaders chose conquest over trade, negotiation, or a reduction of their military ambitions. Germany followed a related logic. Hitler claimed that Germany needed farmland, resources, and territory in the east to become independent of foreign imports and resistant to blockade. But Germany's economic ambitions were inseparable from Nazi racial ideology. The planned war in Eastern Europe was not intended only to defeat enemy armies. It was designed to destroy political communities, remove populations, exploit labor, and reorganize an entire region according to Nazi racial beliefs. By the summer of 1939, Hitler's next target was Poland. But before attacking, Germany needed to solve a strategic problem: the Soviet Union. Hitler hated communism and had repeatedly spoken of conquering Soviet territory. But he did not want to fight Britain, France, Poland, and the Soviet Union at the same time. Joseph Stalin also distrusted Germany, but he had little confidence in Britain and France. Negotiations for a possible anti-German alliance moved slowly and were filled with suspicion. Then, on August 23, 1939, the world received shocking news. Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union had signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The public agreement promised that the two countries would not attack each other. But a secret protocol divided parts of Eastern Europe into German and Soviet spheres of influence. Poland was to be divided between them. The agreement did not create Hitler's desire to invade Poland. But it removed the greatest immediate obstacle. Germany could attack without expecting Soviet resistance. Stalin gained time to strengthen the Soviet military and an opportunity to expand Soviet control westward. In the early hours of September 1st, Germany invaded Poland. On September 3rd, Britain and France declared war on Germany. On September 17th, Soviet forces entered eastern Poland. Within weeks, organized Polish resistance had been defeated, and the country was divided between Germany and the Soviet Union. The European War had begun. Germany's victory in Poland is often associated with the term Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. The success did not come from one secret weapon. It came from concentrating armored forces, coordinating aircraft with ground units, disrupting communication, and advancing rapidly through weak points before the enemy could reorganize. Polish forces resisted fiercely, but they faced attacks from two directions. Britain and France were unable to launch a Western offensive powerful enough to save Poland. After Poland fell, the Western Front entered a strange period of limited activity. Britain and France were officially at war with Germany, but for several months there was no major ground campaign in the West. That calm ended in April 1940, when Germany invaded Denmark and Norway. Control of Norway protected Germany's access to Swedish iron ore and provided valuable bases along the North Atlantic. Then, on May 10, 1940, Hitler turned west. German forces invaded the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and France. British and French commanders expected the main German attack to move through central Belgium, similar to the German advance during the First World War. The strongest Allied formations moved north to meet it. But the main German armored force passed through the Ardennes, a forested region the Allies considered difficult for a major mechanized offensive. After crossing the Meuse River, German armored units drove toward the English Channel. Their movement cut off large British, French, and Belgian forces in the north. Hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers were pushed toward the coastal area around Dunkirk. The British organized an emergency evacuation. Naval vessels and civilian boats crossed the English Channel to rescue troops from the beaches and harbor. The evacuation saved much of the British Expeditionary Force, but vast amounts of equipment had to be abandoned. France continued fighting, but its defensive system had been broken. Paris fell in June. On June 22, 1940, France signed an armistice. Germany occupied northern and western France. A collaborationist government was established in the southern town of Vichy. In only a few weeks, one of Europe's largest military powers had been defeated. Hitler now controlled or dominated most of Western and Central Europe. But Britain refused to surrender. For Germany to invade the British Isles, it first needed control of the air. Beginning in the summer of 1940, the German Air Force attacked British airfields, radar stations, aircraft production centers, and later major cities. This campaign became known as the Battle of Britain. The Royal Air Force fought under intense pressure, but Britain had several advantages. Radar and ground observers provided early warning. British pilots fought close to their own bases, while German aircraft operated at the edge of their range. Pilots from Poland, Czechoslovakia, Canada, New Zealand, and other countries also joined the defense. When German attacks shifted from airfields to London and other cities, the Royal Air Force gained time to recover. By the end of October 1940, Germany had failed to achieve the air superiority required for an invasion. Britain had survived. It could not yet defeat Germany on the European continent, but it remained a base from which future resistance could continue. For the first time, Hitler's expansion had suffered a major strategic failure. Meanwhile, the war expanded into the Mediterranean, North Africa, and the Balkans. Mussolini brought Italy into the conflict in June 1940, believing France was already defeated and that the war might soon end. But Italian forces struggled in North Africa and Greece. Hitler was forced to send German units to support his ally. In the North African desert, German and Italian forces under Erwin Rommel repeatedly pushed British troops back toward Egypt. The region was strategically important because the Suez Canal connected the Mediterranean to the routes leading toward India and Asia. Beyond Egypt lay the oil resources of the Middle East. Germany also intervened in the Balkans. In April 1941, German forces invaded Yugoslavia and Greece. Both countries were defeated quickly, although resistance movements continued fighting throughout the occupation. By the middle of 1941, Hitler appeared to be at the height of his power. Germany controlled or dominated most of continental Europe. Britain remained in the war but could not yet return to the continent. The United States had not entered the conflict directly. Hitler now moved toward the central objective of his ideology: the destruction of the Soviet Union. On June 22, 1941, Germany and its allies launched Operation Barbarossa. More than 3 million Axis soldiers advanced along a front stretching from the Baltic region to the Black Sea. It was one of the largest land invasions in history. The German forces advanced in 3 main directions. Army Group North moved toward Leningrad. Army Group Center advanced toward Moscow. Army Group South pushed into Ukraine and toward the agricultural land, industries, and routes leading to the oil fields of the Caucasus. During the first months, German forces achieved enormous victories. Soviet armies were surrounded. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were captured. Much of the Soviet Air Force was destroyed or damaged on the ground. Stalin had ignored multiple warnings of an approaching invasion. Earlier political purges had also weakened the Soviet officer corps. But the Soviet Union did not collapse. Its enormous territory stretched German supply lines. Roads were poor, rail systems used different gauges, and the German army lacked enough trucks to support operations at such distances. Soviet forces suffered catastrophic losses but continued to mobilize new armies. Factories were dismantled and moved eastward beyond German control. Soviet industry continued producing tanks, aircraft, guns, and ammunition. By the time winter arrived, German forces had failed to capture Moscow. In December 1941, the Red Army counterattacked and pushed German formations away from the Soviet capital. The rapid war Hitler had expected was over. Germany was now trapped in a war of attrition against a state with vast territory, a massive population, and enormous industrial potential. The invasion also transformed the conflict into an openly racial and genocidal war. Mobile killing units followed the German army into Soviet territory. They murdered Jewish communities, Soviet officials, Roma people, and others identified as enemies by the Nazi state. Millions of Soviet prisoners of war were denied adequate food, shelter, and medical care. Many died from starvation, disease, exposure, or execution. By late 1941 and 1942, Nazi persecution developed into a systematic program to murder the Jews of Europe. Deportation trains carried victims to ghettos, forced labor sites, concentration camps, and killing centers in occupied Poland. The Holocaust was not separate from the war. German conquest gave the Nazi state access to millions of people it intended to exploit, deport, or destroy. While Hitler fought the Soviet Union, Japan moved closer to war with the United States. The conflict in China consumed Japanese manpower and resources without producing a decisive victory. To isolate China and obtain more raw materials, Japan expanded farther into Southeast Asia. The United States opposed this expansion. Washington froze Japanese assets and restricted Japan's access to oil and other strategic materials. Japanese leaders faced a choice. They could reduce their military ambitions in China, or they could seize the oil fields and resources of Southeast Asia. They chose war. On the morning of December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft attacked the United States Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The objective was to disable American naval power long enough for Japan to conquer a vast defensive perimeter across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. Japanese leaders believed the United States might eventually decide that reversing these conquests would be too expensive. The following day, the United States declared war on Japan. Germany and Italy then declared war on the United States. The wars in Europe and Asia had become one global conflict. During the first months of 1942, Japan achieved a series of rapid victories. Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, and many Pacific islands were attacked or occupied. The fall of Singapore was a particularly severe shock to the British Empire. A major British base, once considered nearly impossible to capture, surrendered to Japanese forces. Japan now controlled a vast empire containing oil, rubber, minerals, and strategically important sea routes. But Japan faced the same fundamental problem as Germany. Its conquests were larger than its ability to defend and supply them. Thousands of miles of territory required cargo ships, fuel, aircraft, trained pilots, mechanics, and naval protection. The United States possessed an industrial capacity Japan could not match in a long war. If Japan failed to force Washington into negotiations quickly, the strategic balance would shift against it. In June 1942, Japan attempted to capture Midway Island and destroy the remaining American aircraft carriers. But American intelligence had partially broken Japanese naval codes and prepared an ambush. During the Battle of Midway, American carrier aircraft sank 4 major Japanese aircraft carriers. The United States lost the carrier Yorktown, but Japan lost experienced pilots and technical personnel who were extremely difficult to replace. Midway did not destroy the Japanese Navy, but it ended Japan's ability to expand with the same freedom it had enjoyed during the first months of the war. 2 months later, American forces landed on Guadalcanal and the Solomon Islands. The battle lasted for months and involved fighting on land, at sea, and in the air. Japan tried repeatedly to reinforce the island, while American forces struggled to hold Henderson Field. By early 1943, Japan had withdrawn. The United States was moving from defense to sustained offensive operations. At the same time, the balance was changing in North Africa and the Soviet Union. In the summer of 1942, Hitler launched a new offensive in southern Soviet territory. His objectives included the oil fields of the Caucasus and the transportation routes along the Volga River. The city of Stalingrad became the center of the campaign. German forces entered much of the city, but the battle turned into a struggle for factories, apartment blocks, basements, streets, and individual rooms. Close-range urban fighting reduced Germany's advantage in mobility. Both sides continued sending troops into a city that was being destroyed around them. In November 1942, the Red Army launched a major counteroffensive. Instead of attacking the strongest German positions inside Stalingrad, Soviet forces struck the Romanian armies guarding the German flanks. The Soviet attacks met behind the city, surrounding the German Sixth Army. Hitler refused to permit a withdrawal. He believed the Luftwaffe could supply the trapped forces by air. It could not. Winter, hunger, disease, Soviet attacks, and ammunition shortages destroyed the surrounded army. At the end of January and beginning of February 1943, the remaining German forces in Stalingrad surrendered. The defeat destroyed an entire German field army and shattered the impression that Hitler's forces were unbeatable. More importantly, the Red Army had begun to seize the strategic initiative. In North Africa, British forces under Bernard Montgomery defeated Rommel's army at El Alamein in late 1942. At almost the same time, American and British forces landed in Morocco and Algeria during Operation Torch. Axis forces in North Africa were trapped between Allied armies advancing from the east and west. By May 1943, the remaining German and Italian troops in Tunisia had surrendered. The Allies now controlled North Africa and could prepare for an invasion of southern Europe. Between the middle of 1942 and early 1943, three major turning points changed the direction of the war. At Midway and Guadalcanal, Japan lost the strategic initiative in the Pacific. At El Alamein in Tunisia, the Axis lost North Africa. At Stalingrad, Germany suffered a catastrophic defeat in the Soviet Union. The Axis powers were still capable of fighting for years. But their realistic path to overall victory was disappearing. In July 1943, Allied forces invaded Sicily. The operation caused a political crisis in Italy. Mussolini was removed from power, and the new Italian government began looking for a way to leave the war. But Italy's surrender did not end the fighting on the peninsula. German forces quickly occupied northern and central Italy, rescued Mussolini, and established a dependent fascist government under his leadership. The Allied advance through Italy became slow and costly. Mountainous terrain and prepared German defensive lines made rapid movement difficult. Battles at Monte Cassino, Anzio, and other locations demonstrated that Germany could still defend effectively even while losing the wider war. On the Eastern Front, Germany made one final major attempt to regain the initiative near Kursk in July 1943. The Soviet Union knew the general direction of the attack and built deep defensive systems containing trenches, mines, artillery positions, and reserve forces. The German offensive failed. The Red Army then launched a sequence of counteroffensives. From that point onward, German armies in the east were increasingly forced to retreat. At the same time, British and American bombers intensified their attacks on German industry, transportation systems, oil production, and cities. The campaign damaged the German war economy and forced Germany to divert aircraft, artillery, and personnel away from the front lines. It also caused enormous civilian casualties. By 1944, Germany faced pressure from several directions. The Soviet Union advanced from the east. Allied armies pushed through Italy from the south. In Britain, a massive invasion force prepared to open a new front in Western Europe. On the morning of June 6, 1944, Allied forces landed on the coast of Normandy. It was D-Day. Airborne troops landed behind German positions. Warships bombarded coastal defenses. Thousands of landing craft carried American, British, Canadian, and other Allied soldiers toward 5 invasion beaches. Some landings met less resistance than expected. At Omaha Beach, American troops faced strong defensive fire, obstacles, and difficult terrain. Casualties were severe. But by the end of the day, the Allies had secured important positions on the French coast. D-Day did not immediately liberate France. Allied forces still had to fight through the dense hedgerows of Normandy. German units defended aggressively, and the buildup of men, vehicles, ammunition, and supplies required time. But Germany failed to push the invasion force back into the sea. A major Western front had been opened. Only weeks later, the Soviet Union launched Operation Bagration in the east. The offensive destroyed much of Germany's army group's center and liberated large areas of Belarus. The near-simultaneous offensives exposed Germany's central strategic problem. It had to divide declining military resources between multiple fronts while the Allies possessed growing superiority in soldiers, tanks, aircraft, fuel, and industrial production. In August 1944, Paris was liberated. German forces withdrew toward their own borders. But Allied hopes that the war might end before the end of the year proved premature. Supply lines had become stretched. Many ports had been damaged or remained under German control. Operation Market Garden, an ambitious Allied airborne offensive in the Netherlands, failed to secure a route across the Rhine. Then, in December 1944, Hitler launched his final major offensive in the west. German forces attacked through the Ardennes, attempting to divide the British and American armies, capture Antwerp, and force the Western Allies to negotiate. The offensive created a large bulge in the Allied lines, giving the battle its common name, the Battle of the Bulge. Bad weather initially limited Allied air power. Several American units were surrounded, and the German advance created confusion. But Germany lacked sufficient fuel, reserves, and transportation. When the weather improved, Allied aircraft returned. The German offensive failed, consuming tanks, aircraft, and experienced soldiers that could not be replaced. By early 1945, the outcome in Europe was almost certain. But the war continued because Hitler refused to surrender and the Nazi state continued mobilizing soldiers, elderly men, and teenagers for a hopeless defense. Western Allied armies crossed the Rhine and advanced into central Germany. Soviet armies moved through Poland, East Prussia, and toward Berlin. As Allied troops advanced, they liberated concentration camps and killing sites. Soldiers discovered starving prisoners, unburied bodies, warehouses filled with confiscated possessions, and evidence of systematic mass murder. The scale of Nazi crimes was no longer hidden behind occupied borders. In April 1945, Soviet forces surrounded Berlin. Fighting moved through streets, government buildings, railway stations, and residential districts. On April 30th, Hitler killed himself inside his underground bunker. The government that followed him had no realistic ability to continue the war. Germany signed an unconditional surrender on May 7, 1945. The surrender took effect on May 8 across most of Europe. Because of time zone differences and the timing of the final signing in Berlin, the Soviet Union commemorated victory on May 9. The war in Europe was over. But the Second World War was not. Across Asia and the Pacific, Japan continued fighting. After Guadalcanal, the United States advanced along two main routes. Forces under General Douglas MacArthur moved through New Guinea toward the Philippines. Naval and Marine forces advanced across the Central Pacific. The United States often bypassed heavily fortified Japanese bases. Instead of attacking every occupied island, American forces captured locations that could support airfields, harbors, and future operations. Bypassing isolated strongholds reduced some casualties and allowed the Allies to move closer to Japan. In 1944, American forces captured islands in the Marshall and Mariana Groups. Bases in the Marianas brought the Japanese home islands within range of B-29 bombers. In October 1944, American forces returned to the Philippines. The Battle of Leyte Gulf severely weakened what remained of Japanese naval power. Japan increasingly used kamikaze attacks, in which pilots deliberately crashed aircraft into Allied ships. Japanese resistance was influenced by a military culture that treated surrender as shameful. Many commanders believed that inflicting sufficiently high casualties might weaken American public support for the war or produce more favorable surrender terms. In 1945, American forces attacked Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Both battles were extremely costly. Okinawa was particularly important because it was close enough to serve as a base for a possible invasion of the Japanese home islands. After Okinawa, the United States prepared for the possibility of such an invasion. Military planners expected it to cause very heavy casualties on both sides, although the exact estimates remain disputed by historians. At the same time, Japanese cities faced increasingly destructive air attacks. In March 1945, incendiary bombing devastated large areas of Tokyo and killed a vast number of civilians. Japan had lost much of its navy. Its shipping routes were being destroyed. Fuel and food supplies were becoming scarce. Industrial production was collapsing. Yet the Japanese government had not accepted unconditional surrender. One major issue was the future of Emperor Hirohito. Some Japanese leaders feared that unconditional surrender could mean the abolition of the imperial institution or the prosecution of the emperor. Meanwhile, the United States had completed a new weapon. On July 16, 1945, the first atomic bomb was successfully tested in New Mexico. The Manhattan Project had secretly brought together scientists, engineers, military personnel, and enormous industrial resources. On July 26, the United States, Britain, and China issued the Potsdam Declaration, demanding Japan's unconditional surrender. Japan did not immediately accept. On the morning of August 6, 1945, an American B-29 dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. The explosion destroyed much of the city. Tens of thousands of people died immediately, and many more later died from burns, injuries, and radiation exposure. On August 8, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. In the early hours of August 9, Soviet forces launched a massive invasion of Japanese-controlled Manchuria. Later that same day, the United States dropped a second atomic bomb on Nagasaki. Within a matter of days, Japan's leaders faced several simultaneous realities. The United States possessed a weapon capable of destroying a city with a single bomb. The Soviet Union was no longer a possible mediator. It was now an enemy. Japan's military position was collapsing, and the possibility of obtaining favorable terms through continued resistance was disappearing. Historians continue to debate the relative importance of the atomic bombs, the Soviet invasion, the naval blockade, conventional bombing, and Japan's economic exhaustion. Japan's surrender should not be reduced to one factor alone. What is clear is that the combination of these shocks caused Emperor Hirohito to intervene in favor of ending the war. On August 15, the Japanese people heard the emperor's voice by radio announcing the acceptance of the surrender terms. On September 2, 1945, Japanese representatives signed the formal surrender aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. The Second World War was over. What ultimately decided the outcome of the war? The Axis powers achieved remarkable early victories through surprise, concentrated force, operational experience, and the weakness or unpreparedness of their opponents. Germany avoided a prolonged struggle at first by defeating or isolating individual countries one after another. Japan took advantage of the European war to expand across Asia and the Pacific. But the Axis strategy contained a fundamental contradiction. Germany and Japan attempted to build empires larger than their economic and military systems could sustain. Every conquest lengthened supply lines, created more territory to defend, and brought more enemies into the war. Hitler failed to defeat Britain before invading the Soviet Union. He then declared war on the United States. Germany eventually faced the manpower and strategic depth of the Soviet Union, the naval strength and global connections of the British Empire, and the industrial power of the United States. Japan failed to destroy the American aircraft carriers at Pearl Harbor. It could not force Washington to negotiate quickly, and it could not replace ships, aircraft, pilots, or fuel at the same rate as the United States. Allied victory did not come from one battle. It came from industrial production, logistics, intelligence, scientific development, international cooperation, and the sacrifice of millions of soldiers and civilians. The Soviet Union carried the largest share of the land war against Germany in Europe and suffered extraordinary losses. Britain remained in the war during the period when Germany dominated much of the continent. China continued resisting Japan for years and tied down large Japanese forces. The United States supplied enormous quantities of weapons, vehicles, ships, aircraft, fuel, and food. After entering the war, it deployed major forces across both the Atlantic and Pacific. But victory did not erase the cost. Approximately 6 million Jewish people were murdered during the Holocaust. Millions of Roma people, Soviet prisoners of war, Polish civilians, disabled people, political opponents, and other victims were persecuted or killed by Nazi Germany and its collaborators. Millions of civilians across the Soviet Union, China, Poland, Germany, Japan, and many other countries died from combat, massacres, bombing, starvation, disease, and forced labor. Cities were destroyed. Families disappeared. Tens of millions of people were displaced. No single casualty estimate is accepted by every historian, but the Second World War remains the deadliest conflict in modern history. Its consequences reshaped the international system. Germany was divided into occupation zones. Japan was disarmed and occupied under American leadership. Major Nazi officials were prosecuted at Nuremberg, where international courts addressed crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The United Nations was established in the hope of creating a stronger system of international security than the League of Nations. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged as superpowers, but their wartime alliance quickly gave way to the Cold War. European colonial empires had been weakened, helping accelerate independence movements across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Germany was divided. Korea was divided. Eastern Europe fell under Soviet influence, while Western Europe increasingly aligned with the United States. Even after the shooting stopped, the war continued to shape politics, borders, technology, law, memory, and international conflict. So what truly caused the Second World War? The immediate trigger in Europe was Germany's invasion of Poland on September 1, 1939. The principal cause was the deliberate expansionist policy of Hitler and Nazi Germany, combined with the imperial ambitions of militarist Japan and fascist Italy. These regimes did not merely react to difficult circumstances. They consciously chose war as an instrument for building empires. But their aggression became possible because of deeper conditions. The unresolved legacy of the First World War. Resentment surrounding the Treaty of Versailles. The Great Depression. The weakening of democratic institutions. Extreme nationalism. Racial ideology. Imperial competition. The struggle for resources. The failure of the League of Nations. And the repeated inability of other powers to stop aggression before it expanded. No single factor made the war completely inevitable. Versailles did not force Hitler to invade Poland. The Great Depression did not force Germans to support Nazism. Appeasement did not remove the responsibility of the aggressor. Resource shortages did not force Japan to conquer China and Southeast Asia. Every crisis offered more than one possible choice. The people holding power chose one of them. That may be the most important lesson of the entire story. Great wars rarely begin with one decision. They are constructed over time through lies that remain unchallenged, acts of aggression that go unpunished, institutions that gradually lose authority, and repeated retreats that convince aggressors no one will ever stop them. September 1, 1939, was not the day the world suddenly lost control. It was the day when consequences that had accumulated for nearly 2 decades finally appeared on the battlefield. And September 2, 1945, was not simply the day the war ended. It was the day the world began confronting what the war had left behind. Destroyed cities. Entire communities erased. Empires collapsing. 2 new superpowers confronting each other. and weapons powerful enough to threaten the future of human civilization. The Second World War began with the belief that one nation could secure its future by taking the future away from others. It ended with proof that a war of that scale leaves no nation completely untouched. There were countries that achieved victory. There were governments that survived. But beneath every flag, there were families who never saw their loved ones return. And there was a world forced to rebuild itself from consequences that human beings had chosen to create.